Hello, my name is Lynge-Jorlén and I have the pleasure of moderating this talk on fashion in the museum. Fashion has been part of design and crafts museums since the 19th century, but it's only in more recent years that art museums have begun to display fashion, at least in a Nordic context. Some fashion designers create unique works with a high degree of criticality and conceptualization, and artists turn to clothes and textiles and fashion in aesthetic work that centers on the human body. And that strand of work is increasingly being featured in Nordic museums. To help me cast light on this exciting topic, I have a stellar panel with Minna, director of the Röhsska Museum of Design and Craft in Sweden, Marie Laurberg, director of Copenhagen Contemporary, and last but definitely not least, Minna Palmqvist, designer and artist. And I will just begin by flagging up that we are all here connected into exhibitions. The forthcoming exhibitions are the Nordic Fashion Now, Knitwear and Print at the Röhsska, and Beautiful Repair at Copenhagen Contemporary. Marie, I would like to begin with you. On the 1st of February, Copenhagen Contemporary will open its first ever fashion exhibition where fashion is included along, or it's not a fashion exhibition, but it's an exhibition where fashion is included alongside art. Why is fashion interesting in the context of an art institution, in your view?
I think the exhibition Beautiful Repair really addresses a new generation of creatives across the fields of contemporary art and fashion design that are very much concerned with similar topics and whose aesthetic expression is very similar on specific points. So for us it was a very good opportunity to investigate what is going on in the intersection between art and fashion design right now, and what are the new aesthetic paths that are being taken by these artists and designers. And I think a main theme in the show is very closely connected to sustainability. So the title Beautiful Repair refers to what we have coined, working on the exhibition, as the aesthetics of repair. That artists and designers are really very sort of creatively diving into repair as something that's not just supposed to mend what was broken and bring it back to an original state, but rather really as a way of enhancing the expression of an object and giving new meaning to the object. So for us in CC, we're a house for contemporary art, but also for contemporary creativity. So for us, this new aesthetic phenomenon is super interesting.
And also the timing of why now, I guess, that this is happening right now.
Well, we're following the artists and the creatives. So this tendency, it's out there. It's really an emergent field that's just expanding. And I think for us, putting very tight fences between different aesthetic disciplines is not very interesting, because working with artists, you'll always learn that very few artists are only into like art. Most creatives are really looking into different fields. They're inspired by literature, film, anthropology, all different kinds of things. And I think there's a really century-long love affair between art and fashion that was under-addressed in institutions, and we would like to start investigating what goes on between the two disciplines. And so for us, this is just the first start of that investigation.
And exactly as you're saying, that this is not new. In fact, fashion designers and artists have inspired each other and even worked with each other for more than 100 years. But it's interesting to sort of see how I find that Danish, at least art museums, have been reluctant to including fashion into their halls of holiness, so to speak. When you did Kusama, when you were working at Louisiana, and you even included Kusama's fashion, which was such a new thing at the time. I wonder, why do you think that art museums have avoided fashion for so long?
It's an interesting question, I think, and an important question, because in Danish institutions, we really proud of our architectural heritage. We're really proud of our furniture design. That's really the whole golden age of Danish furniture design. So these disciplines are accepted as something that has cultural value and status similar to art, whereas fashion has had a different position. And I think there can be many possible answers to why. I think one of them is that fashion has been associated very much with the feminine realm, and which has just historically had a lower status. So, and that's one thing. And then on the other hand, also, I think the commercial dimension of the fashion world has led some institutions to question the integrity of bringing it into the exhibition space. But looking at it from a broader art historical perspective, I mean, fashion and art has been intertwined again and again and again. And a lot of artists have either worked closely with fashion designers or even, designed clothes themselves. And it has always been artists who were really concerned with bringing art into public space, into the daily lives. Very often artists associated with counterculture or avant-gardist rethinking of everyday life. So the surrealists, of course, in the 30s and 20s had a very close relationship with fashion and has also created works that have inspired fashion designers ever since. Kusama, I think a lot of people watching this will know her collaborations with Louis Vuitton. She just had a second round recently that sparked a lot of debate. But when you look at her work, actually her interest in fashion design goes back to the 60s. So in the 1960s, she created the Kusama Fashion Institute in New York and designed very sort of experimental garments that were really designed for sex orgies and different kinds of nude shows, etc. So that they would have really like explicit big holes on very sort of, selected parts of the body that would enable sexual encounters even though you are dressed, or even like clothes that several people would wear at once to create a different social meeting via clothes. So it's not new. And in her case, it was really about bringing art into daily life and using art as a tool to redesign human interaction. And I think some of these thoughts are really present in the show that we're preparing at CC now, because a lot of the designers you can see they're storytellers, or even like have these imaginary figures that they're dressing. And to me, it's all about trying to change the social fabric through fashion design. Really looking at how do we express ourselves through clothes? How do we interact in social space or in public space through the clothes we wear? What are the signals? What are the social positions that we're communicating? And really, like, how can we also create changes of value through clothes? And I think the show, speaking about sustainability, has, to me at least, it has very much to do with discussing what is beauty, what is beautiful, and how does beauty relate to notions of perfection. Because in my eyes, all the artists and designers in the show are searching for beauty beyond any idea of perfection. They're simply searching for beauty in other places.
Yeah, it's a central part, and we'll come back to that with Minna, because that's so central to your work as well. But I'd like to follow up with you, Nina, because you worked at the V&A and you worked at the Design Museum in London, and both museums are famous for their big-scale fashion shows. And you're now director at the Röhsska Museum of Design and Craft. And the Röhsska also has a very rich fashion collection, and the museums had several fashion exhibitions. I'm curious, coming from London back to Scandinavia, how you've seen fashion. Has it flourished in a Scandinavian museum context, or is fashion treated differently, you'd say, obviously at the Röhsska, but also perhaps more widely? Do you see fashion being treated differently in Scandinavia versus the UK?
I think there are different treatments potentially, but I think it's also important to remember that with London, for example, where I have spent my longest time, it's also such a big city that you have so many different venues which can play on different scales of presenting fashion, and also different types of museums. We can't look at museums as all the same. There are art museums, there are design museums, there are museums of anthropology and even city museums that often themselves also have a large fashion collection, but with a very different emphasis. So in London and also Paris, which are maybe the two big cities who have led the way when it comes to fashion shows in both applied arts museums as well as art museums, I find it difficult to make the comparison. I think it's more about Scandinavia in design terms have always been quite restrained in the way that we think about form and function and sort of the Scandinavian image of design. And I think that's even been reflected in maybe how fashion design has been shown in exhibitions up until quite recently. And that's a level perhaps of conservatism, that it's been not as daring, and it potentially hasn't had the audience to kind of value the more daring exhibitions. But it's really interesting now to see the shift where Scandinavian venues are not only celebrating more experimental fashion, but also the fact that these designers and makers come from the Nordic region themselves. With we look to Europe, to London and Paris for the big fashion houses, the big brands, and I think the audience themselves want to feel some sort of familiarity when they go into a show, and therefore these big names have always attracted a large audience. I think as organizations in Scandinavia, we need to be a little bit braver as to what we choose to show actually within fashion. And like at CC, I think it's a great move to actually focus on something that isn't necessarily a big name or a big fashion house, but a tendency that is so important to raise within fashion. And I would say, whilst Röhsska, for example, has a fantastic fashion collection, one of the things we look at is also we have great historical fashion examples, but we also need to bring up to date the more contemporary fashion to kind of really try and portray what is mirroring society today, and therefore the show that we're going to be having soon also at the Röhsska Museum will be a great way to celebrate young Nordic talent within the fashion industry. I think museums have a great way to go into fashion that a magazine, a fashion show or an editorial can't do, and that is that we really are showing something that isn't just seasonal or a drop, but we can show a much more longer narration that both also contextualizes someone's fashion house or brand or a theme through history and giving cultural context. And I think that is what makes museums sort of that platform that perhaps fashion has lacked in Scandinavia, that we are in addition to really bringing fashion onto the stage in a more artistic cultural context as well. And it's not just a consumerism focus that tends to be.
I think you're very right in what you were kind of saying with the Museum of Applied Arts and Design. There seems to be this undercurrent of taste. You know, good taste, that design has been displayed as something which is, we keep it, we collect it if it's made properly, if it's in good taste. Whereas art that's collected might not even be well made, but it's not the point, you know.
Precisely.
And I think you're so right in what you're saying about being braver with fashion, because you can't display stuff that is not even made perfectly, but it has a different point of departure. Exactly. It's a different message to be communicated. I wonder also, it seems to me, as we were talking about, that the Röhsska Museum operates with an extended definition of design, one that perhaps departs slightly from what I was just saying, because you also show contemporary art in the museum. So I just wonder how you see the interface at the museum between design, fashion and contemporary art.
We have been trying to work for the last few years under the device of that design is everywhere. And I think nowadays you can really, just like art tends to be so broad, design is also much broader in its disciplines than it was 15, 20 years ago. And we see that design practitioners also use the same tools and mechanisms that an artist does, and vice versa. You have architecture firms with designers and artists working alongside each other. I think being more open to these cross-disciplinary ways of working also has to be seen in a design museum, not just that art museums, for example, choose to work with designers and architects, but also that design museums choose to work with art. I think the big thing for me is that whilst art exists at Röhsska, it is still contextualized and grounded in some sort of design method or application, or craft for that matter. And of course, craft exists really in the border line between art and craft anyway. So I think there is about embracing the flexibility that design and craft offers. And with our most recent show with Lapsilam, who is very much an artist first and foremost, by inviting someone to work with our collection, say, all of a sudden you are sort of opening up an opportunity to really investigate craft mechanisms and processes as well as design processes. And in her case, specifically, what's it called? Digital design processes, which she would have used anyway in her artwork, but where we see these techniques and approaches that designers also sit and use. And I think it's about opening these perspectives to our visitors, and artists sometimes can more easily go into that area and share perhaps than a designer does.
Minna, we've been listening to the director of the art museum, the director of the design museum, and you as a fashion designer and an artist, you work at the very intersection between fashion and art. You have a degree in clothes making, which is followed by a degree in textile art from art school, and your work has been displayed internationally alongside the likes of Lynge-Jorlén and Martin Margiela. And I wonder, it might be a big question, but I wonder how you integrate art and fashion in your work, and how the two disciplines feed off of each other when you work.
Yeah, it's a big question. but for me, it's also floaty. It's like inside of me, I have this urge to discuss things, which I do through making and through visuals. And it springs from fashion. It springs from like a lust to make clothes that when I finished my bachelor, like, why am I making clothes? I don't just want to make another party top for someone. And I applied for masters, and I got accepted for Konstfack, which was perfect because I dig into all questions I had about why are we wearing this? Why are we doing that? So it springs from like, that I find clothing so direct and so interesting in that way, how it changes your posture and your whole like way of walking and being, and you can just play so much with it, and also how clothes can be so restraining because there's so many rules. What can you do? What can't you do? So this is something I really started digging into during my time at Konstfack, which is now, I don't even know, 15 years ago, I think. But and since then, I think there I dared to become more like, I work from fashion. Now I see fashion, it sounds a bit like, but it's sort of my toolbox. I still make clothes. I make clothes that I sell. I make clothes, I do photo shoots. But it's always integrated with that. I also do installations. I do video works. It's methods that I use to make things. For example, I have pieces where I just squeeze stuff into, this is a very Scandinavian thing, but hopefully many people watching this will know what a mangel is, like a mango machine where you usually used to press your sheets so they are crispy, clean and perfect, like a housewife sort of thing to do. But then I just squeeze stuff in with glue and they come out like all cringe and it's sort of methods where I'm like investigating perfection, as we were speaking about, and the methods of and mechanisms of fashion, the rules, the money, the environment, everything is sort of baked into it. So for me, it's just floating back and forth. So how they interact with each other, they just do. And I can make an art piece and then see like, whoa, I could take that detail and try to put that into a garment. And this is how it, for example, now at CC, I'm showing one piece was made in 2009 and one is made in 2021, and they're super related.
We can perhaps just share that at CC you will be exhibiting a distorted fitting room with pink curtains.
Yes.
You will be showing a giant pink balloon sculpture that will deflate in the course of the exhibition, alongside a video of a melting butter torso.
Yeah, butter torso. Yeah.
And I think what you were saying about pressure is perhaps something we should also address, because you're using this device where you get the crispy sheets, but what your work, as I see it, is so centered on is pressure.
Yeah,
societal and cultural pressure. What is it with that topic that you find so...
I always
important?
obsess on topics like my whole like work lab. I worked mostly around and still do like how the female body is looked as something that is there to please someone else, and all these rules you have to adjust to and everything. This is something that I've been working on for like 15 years, but I think it was 2019, which is a bit ironic because it was a couple of months before the pandemic that I started feeling more of an urge to dig into what is it like to work in the creative field. It started like that, and then it's just growing into pressure of all kinds. But then it was like you're asked to do something and you get super short of time and it's little money, and you try to do 10 things at once, and this squeezing stuff into this machine became some sort of therapy. And the beauty of it when it came out made me sort of like, I wanted to stay positive, which is not really my strong side, but I was like, from pressure, something else can come out. And then pandemic hit, and this that just started. Yeah, so it's like I want to investigate the pressure from body norms and the pressure of like economic pressure and from environment, and I mean you can add whatever you want into it, but when people ask what is under pressure, I'm like, what is not?
What is not under pressure? Yeah, I hear you. I think what is sort of the underlying theme here is what happens to fashion, in a sense, when it enters into the museum context. And I'd like to ask you, Nina, because sort of traditionally and simply put, we have this kind of idea that design is meant to solve problems. It's based on functionality, right? And we have art, the idea of fine art. It should provoke kind of thoughts and emotions, and that's obviously a very dated way of seeing stuff. But there's something happening to any object that enters into a museum, and there's a theory addressing this as a process of artification, right? So, and do you agree? Is there something to be said about what happens to fashion when it enters into any museum, whether it's applied arts museum or an art museum? What happens to the cultural and symbolic status of that object, in your view?
I think there is something to be said of it being more looked up on, and the idea of putting things on pedestals in museums will, I think, always happen in some shape or form when it comes from the catwalk to the museum, or from even the art gallery to the museum. Something changes in its understanding and its context. But I think it depends on what you want to do with that object. When an object comes to the museum at Röhsska, for example, a design museum, I don't think there is at least a conscious idea to artify it. But of course, it's about perhaps undressing it in a way that isn't about this amazing piece and it's just what you see on the surface. I think as a museum, and certainly a museum of design, which also has a role to undress, to show process, to get behind the scene, you don't need to make it so prestigious in of itself. And that's where I think also an art object has that potential when it is in an art museum. But again, going back to what I was saying earlier about art also being at a design museum, you can go behind the processes in much more in-depth. And for fashion exhibitions, I think there is you see it with the shows that the V&A, for example, have done for years with the big names as such. You get to really see what's happening behind the big fashion houses in a way that you don't see in a fashion show or in a catalogue necessarily. And I think that is where you can also break down the barriers of the artification. Because the risk is, of course, that you will always then perceive fashion as something very elitist.
Yeah.
And I think that is also the role of the museum, to sort of break down those barriers. And we as a museum have a responsibility to try and get to the other side of what's happening and what's led it to being there, and why it's important that just that object is in a museum.
We also need to talk about the idea of the beautiful object. And to me, coming from, a fashion academic background, and that's for you, Marie, looking at the art world from a sort of a fashion perspective, it seems that there is this idea that art that is beautiful and art that is aesthetic is perhaps not valued as being as critical as more conceptual art. And I don't know if that's a misconception or if there's something to be said about the status of beautiful art.
I think these notions have changed within the last, let's say, 20 years, with contemporary art developing into a much broader understanding of the art object and its role. But if you look at it from a historical point of view, you can definitely tell that there are two main aesthetic theories governing or interpreting art in Europe in the 20th century. So one is the avant-gardist notion of art as something like the avant-garde as something that wants to break free of the autonomous art object inside the institution and really see art as a force in society that is breaking down barriers, that's challenging notions of aesthetics and beauty. And in that tradition, like a traditional concept of beauty is not very interesting. Whereas then you, on the other hand, have a theory it's usually associated with Adorno and other theorists.
Frankfurt School.
That would say that really the force of the artwork is really its disconnection from everything that goes on in the rest of society, and that the specific force of art lies within the aesthetics. That is really the specific language of the art object that invites the viewer into something like a completely different realm, an imaginary realm, and a realm of freedom, and everything that tries to make the artwork functional or useful in any traditional sense is actually breaking down the true potential of art and artistic freedom. So, and that discussion is just ongoing. I think it will never be resolved, but and every judgment or discussion about art still today, I think is torn between these two extreme positions, and so you can always find someone who would like to defend the arts in society because it can help us solve a crisis, or it can help, whatever, solve the big global challenges of today's world. And then on the other hand, you will always have a different argument that says, please don't ask art to solve all these big issues, because art's raison d'être is freedom. And it's not about statistics or a specific impact that you can read in a survey of user engagements or whatever, or specifically that it can help solve racism and sexism and climate crisis and these kinds of things, but that really just set art free. And don't ask it to defend itself on other terms than art itself.
I think it's so interesting looking at fashion and contemporary fashion that there's this really strong criticality where the designers are critiquing what they're coming from. They're critiquing shapes, the human body, the structure, the system of fashion, newness for the sake of newness, all of that. And I think that lies so central in your work, Minna. So that kind of criticality that we're used to associating with art, we're finding that in the realm of fashion as well today.
Yeah, definitely. And I started with not even, like I always made my own clothes. I made clothes. People said you should study fashion. I didn't even know you could do that. I come from Åland, like a small island in the middle of Sweden and Finland. I was just, and I was critiquing myself. Well, like I can't do that. All my other friends went to university for something more academic. So did I. I tried to study gender studies, which is sort of what I realized that is what I do now. I just do it in another way. That is not my way to go. But so I think the criticism is quite like rooted also in me, that I was like, I can't do that. That's so superficial, which I then have been questioning all the time, and I've been angry about later. And I talk about it because I'm like, why would that be superficial? Of course there is superficial ways of working with fashion, definitely, but there can also be something else. And so definitely critiquing like that. I find how the business is built and how the rules are built and everything, like who's allowed to be in and out and how should you look and all of that. That's what I'm critiquing, but I'm doing it like through that sort of,
On that note, Minna, Nina, Marie, thank you so much for joining today's talk. It was a pleasure talking to you.
Thanks for inviting us.
Thank you.